Are Chinese being unfairly treated in Africa? This is the question that we are going to cover in this video of China in the Global South. My name is Christian Géraud. I'm the Francophone editor of the China Global South Project, and today I'm going to take you in a conversation about a social issue. Usually in this video, I talk about politics, finance, geopolitics, mining, and everything. But today, I want us to talk about a social issue. And the question is, are Chinese being unfairly treated in Africa? The question comes from a post that was written by a Chinese content creator named Nie Shaorui. Nie Shaorui is based somewhere in Eastern Africa, and he's been there for quite a long time, more than 10 years, if we take into account what is written in his story. The story has been posted on April 25th on his WeChat account. I'm gonna put the original story and the WeChat link down to the bio so you can find the story and read it by yourself. But the story is in Chinese. Luckily for you, we translated the story in both English and in French. If you go on our website in English, you're going to find the title of the story is In Africa, the Chinese are Scapegoats. And in French, the story title is Les Chinois sont des cibles faciles en Afrique. So the conversation that we're going to have tonight is trying to understand how Chinese are perceived in Africa by Africans, and how as Chinese themselves, they see or they think they're being perceived or treated by Africans in Africa. So in his post, he's telling a story. He's telling a quite compelling story. He's taking the case of the China Mall in Nairobi. For those who are not familiar with the story, a few months back, there was a quite difficult situation in Nairobi where local businessmen were protesting against a Chinese mall that's opening up in Nairobi. And in that Chinese mall, imported products from China were sold cheap, and the local business were not happy because they were saying that this mall were attracting all the clientele, and they were losing money because of that. So there was this sentiment that Chinese are stealing the businesses and everything. And there was the Secretary of Commerce of Kenya, Mr. Kuria, was really adamant. He really spoke a lot about that China Mall. He wanted that China Mall being closed and everything. There was a whole story about that, and we even covered the story in our website. I'm gonna put the link down below so you can find the story and have a bit of a background about that story. So what Nie Shaorui is saying in his article is saying that despite everything that China and Chinese are doing in Africa, there is still a bad press about China. And he says that, when a country is not perceived well, the reputation of this country also kind of reflect on the citizen. And it's the same thing that the Chinese are really kind of having in Africa. He has the feeling that, in Africa, in Africa, everyone wants to come against the Chinese. Everyone sees the Chinese being the bad people in Africa, despite the fact that China is investing a lot of money in infrastructure and all. But, when something bad happens, all the press is out there to talk bad about the Chinese. They do everything bad, and they never do something good. But when they do something good, there's not a lot of media coverage about the story. So he was kind of frustrated about the fact that how our Chinese are being treated, and they're being perceived by in Africa. It's things that Chinese are the scapegoat. They're the scapegoat of different internal social issues and economic and political issues that we might have in different African countries. But somehow, when something goes bad, we find Chinese being responsible. In the case of the China Mall in Nairobi, he was saying, basically the economy is doing bad. There are so many things that's happening bad in the Kenyan economy, but somehow they found the China Mall and the Chinese businessmen as responsible. And even though they did not succeed into closing the China Mall, they kind of sued those Chinese companies, the Chinese businesses, because, local retailers and local businessmen decided to sue those Chinese business that are doing business in China Mall, accusing them of, I'm reading down to the story. So Kenyan traders initiated a lawsuit against more than 40 Chinese companies and individuals as the part of the effort to shutter the mall. So he's saying, in my 12 years in East Africa, this is the first time I've known such direct civil litigation targeting Chinese individuals by the local community. The plaintiff demand include preventing the defendant, the Chinese community, from engaging in retail and import trade, investigating the defendant immigration status and work permits, prohibiting the Chinese Chamber of Commerce from assisting the defendant, being the Chinese community, and protecting the interests of local small enterprise. You're gonna find the story, as I say, in our website in both French and English. So I'm not gonna get into the details of the laws, if it was allowed for Chinese business to do that business or not, even though I'm gonna talk about it later on. But for now, I want to focus on one of the claims that he made in his story. He said that in Africa, you hardly hear about any Europeans or Americans being defended, being accused or being sued, or even not the case for Indian and Pakistani. It has become a widely held belief in African society that these individuals should not be trifled with, whereas Chinese people are seen as easy targets. So when you read the story, it's kind of conveying the sentiment that, in Africa, Chinese are unfairly treated, they're mistreated because China doesn't portray as being a powerful country. And that in Africa, Africans will never try, to trifle with an American citizen, with a British citizen, or even with an Indian or with Pakistanis. But when it comes to China, they're the one that easily being targeted when it comes to abduction. They're the ones being easily attacked. But somehow, when it comes to those big powers, to other countries, they don't touch them. So that's the feeling that he has. Throughout the story, the article he's talking about different encounters he had about the local police when they tried to arrest him and to take bribe out of him to make him pay instead of going to the court and everything. He even said that, in Africa, it's easy for Africans to go to court, which I kind of disagree, because in my country, the DRC, people tend to kind of avoid to go to courts. They want to settle any kind of issue outside the court because the court is being corrupted and all. They avoid all of that. But in his story, he's saying that African goes easily to the court, so it's kind of difficult for the Chinese to adapt in that environment where they kind of wish to avoid to go to court. So he has the feeling that there is a kind of bad press about Chinese in Africa. In his story, he gives some advice to the Chinese community on the ground. He said, for the Chinese who are on the ground, they must ensure that their legal status is in order. They have, secondly, to handle their tax prudently and reasonably. Thirdly, they have to make sure to conduct their business with integrity. And lastly, they must avoid infringing upon the interest of others. Throughout the text, he also gives other recommendations. For instance, making sure that they have a good agreement when they hire local employee to make sure to follow the law, to abide by the law and everything, just to avoid to find themselves in a very bad situation with local communities or with the local authorities. So that's the feeling that he has. So when I read the story, I kind of wonder, are we treating Chinese differently that we do treat Europeans or even Indians and Pakistanis in Africa? So me reading his story gave me kind of a different feeling. I kind of agree and also disagree with him in a certain extent. I'd agree with him into the sense that because of the Chinese are present in the places where we usually don't see expat communities, and since they are kind of more close to the local population, they put themselves in a position where they easily get in touch or in contact with very difficult situations. Because they do local business, they do retail business. In some countries, doing retail, foreigners are not allowed to do retail business. So when they do those retail business, they expose themselves in certain circumstances where they kind of find themselves in tension with the local communities. This is the place where you don't see, for instance, Americans, French, or British, because when those people come in Africa, most of them are either working for an NGO or a big companies or for an embassy or anything, something big, which kind of put them in a place where they are quote-unquote untouchable. But for the Chinese, they're more into those places where you see a lot of interaction with the local community. But also, there is something else. The Chinese, it depends. When you go to another country like Zimbabwe or the DRC, where they do mining businesses, in those communities, Chinese are more or less, I'd say, protected because they're coming with big investment and big investment in domain where we know that the government has something to say about that, and in places where we know that officials do have large economic interest and where they kind of pay attention to cover Chinese in those countries. I do know that those who are following me in DRC, they would agree with me when I say that in the mining business, Chinese are untouchable. That's a fact. It's very difficult for local community to win a case against a Chinese company where they've been mistreated, where local employees have been mistreated. That's a fact in DRC. And it's even a fact that we can see similar cases in countries like Zimbabwe. But we can also agree that, on the other hand, we have places where Chinese are kind of more, I'd say, easy to access than others. What about the Pakistanis and the Indians? I don't want to be focusing on the names, but the reality is, even those communities, depending on the countries, they kind of create connection with powerful people, with powerful network, with powerful authorities, somehow who guarantees their protection of their businesses and everything. So when something happens, they're kind of protected. The Chinese also do the same thing. So, as I was saying, when I read this story, I was like, it's half-half. He's telling something true. He's also getting some facts that are not right. The reality is it's more complex. And the complexity comes from the fact that many African countries do not have a strong rule of law. In many African countries, you have corruption, you have corrupted local authorities, you have shady businesses, you do find expat communities, Chinese, Indian, Pakistanis, doing small businesses that are legally reserved only for locals on the ground, only for locals community. But you're going to find Chinese doing those businesses. And you're going to find Pakistanis, Indian doing those businesses. So when they do those kind of businesses in place where it's illegal, for sure, you're going to have social tensions. So in the case of Kenya, I don't want to really dwell much into it because I really don't have the background in terms of law. If in Kenya, China Mall was legally allowed to open business and sell the product, or it was, something that was reserved by law only for Kenyans. That I don't know. Those who are following me from Kenya, please leave the comment and tell us the story. Tell us, what do you think about that? And really, if you do believe that the Chinese were legally doing the business, or it was not, or it was illegal. I know in DRC, depending on the kind of business, there is a certain amount, there is a type of business where expatriates are not allowed to be, where, foreigners are not allowed to do business in, but you do find different expat communities. So the question is, do we treat Chinese differently in Africa? Do we have the kind of feeling that China is not that powerful country that we can mess up with Chinese? Because one thing he got right is the fact that you rarely see places where, I don't know, a local community or any citizen attacking Americans or British, for say. It's like, they're coming from strong and powerful country. People tend to be more careful about how to handle them, how to deal with them. Or do you think that is not right? That Chinese are treated just like any kind of expat in Africa? My feeling, as I say in this video, is quite nuanced. I do believe there are some part of true and there are some part of untruthful facts. And different countries have different realities. There are places where Chinese are untouchable. There are places where Chinese are touchable. There are places where Chinese are more powerful than any other expat communities. And there are businesses in the same country where in that business Chinese are untouchable, in other business they are touchable. It really depends on different context and different situation. So I'd like you to leave the comment and tell us, what do you think? Do you think that we have a different treatment for Chinese in Africa? Or do you think that we treat them just like we treat every other expat community on the continent. So this is gonna be all for me today. If it's your first time watching this video, click the subscribe button and click that ring bell so you're gonna be notified every time we drop a new video of China in the Global South. So if it was your first time here in the China Global South, we cover different topics of China engagement in the Global South. But I most of the time cover stories about Chinese engagement in Africa. It was my pleasure to have you and see you next week for another video of China in the Global South.